In the last few videos, we implemented the whole login screen, its interaction with the Firebase authentication tool, and finally the auth guards to protect our route so only logged users can enter some of them. In this video, we are going to start implementing the whole flow of the register page. We will implement the form validation, the NGRX state and its effects, an integration with Google Maps geolocalization and geocoding, and the service that we'll call the backend. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss this series of videos implementing a real app using the Ionic Framework. Let me first remove this part of the screen as it turned out not to be necessary anymore. Alright, so let's start with the form validation of the register page. I'll go back to the code and create a new folder called form, and inside of this folder I will create a new file called register.page.form.ts. Now I will export a class called registerPageForm, and this class will have a private attribute called formBuilder, which is of the type formBuilder. I'll need this form builder in order to inform the behavior of my form. Now I'll declare a constructor that will receive as parameter a form builder of the type formBuilder. And then I'll set our class's form builder to receive this from the constructor's form builder. Let me also create a new property of this class called form, which will be of the type formGroup. Then I'll create a private function called createForm, which will return a form group. Inside of this function, I'll return a form builder grouped with a configuration object that will create our form in the future. And then I will instantiate the form inside of the constructor by calling this function. I'll also create a function called getForm that will simply return the form. So, as we already have a page, we can extract from it most of the properties we are going to need to have inside of our form. So let's create them. First, I'll need a name, and I'll initialize this name with an empty value. I'll also need an email, which will be also initialized with an empty value. Let me just copy and paste this to make it easier. I'll need a password initialized with an empty value. I'll also need a repeat password with an empty value. And finally, I'll need the phone initialized with an empty value. So this thing I just did corresponds to this part of the screen. Now I'll need the address also. Well, the address is actually formed by all this information we have in this section together. So I'll do something different for the address in our form. Instead of putting it on the same level of the name, email, and so on, I'll tell my form builder to group this address. Then I'll add to it the street, number, neighborhood, and all the other properties inside of this form group. Alright, now we reached the point where I can finally make tests on top of my code. So I'll create a new file called register.page.form.spec.ts. Here I'll describe the tests of my register page form. I'll add to it the property register page form of the type register page form. Before each test, I'll instantiate this property with a new instance of the register page form, which receives as parameter a new form builder. Let me also create a new property called form of the type formGroup and instantiate it with the register page form's create function. And now let's create our first test. It should empty name be invalid. I'll just expect that the form's name has the validity equal to false. Let me save it and tell npm to run the tests, and this test should fail. It fails because we didn't inform that the name of our form is mandatory. So let me go back to the form definition and add to it the required validator. After I save this, our test will pass. Good, now I'm validating that the name in the register form is required. Actually, all the fields in the register form are required, and all the code for this is going to be really similar to this one I just did. Let me quickly move forward as I don't want to bore you by doing some repetitive stuff. Alright, the things I did differently here were: the repeat password field doesn't need to be required, as its validation is only based on the password field. Also, to get the address street, for example, I need to take the form, get the address, and then get the street. Alright, all of our tests for the required fields are passing, so now let's continue. I'll create a new test that should invalid email be invalid. On the form, I'll get the email and set as value an invalid email. Now I'll expect that on the form the email has the validity equal to false. After I save this, our test will fail. What I need to do here is, besides making the email required, I also need to make it be validated as an email. After I save this, our test will pass. Now let's test if the password field has a minimum of 6 characters. I'll copy and paste the previous test, change its title to "Should password less than 6 characters be invalid?" Now on the form, I will get the password and set its value as 12345. After I save this, our test will fail. To make it pass, I'll go to my form and add a validator telling that the minimum length of the field is 6. After I save this, our test will pass. Now I'll copy and paste the password test and change its title to "Should password different from repeat password be invalid?" On the form, I'll get the password and set its value as any password, and on the form, I will get the repeat password and set its value as other password. Now I'll expect that on the form, the repeat password field has its validity as false. After I save this, our test will fail. Good, let's now find a way to make it pass. Here on the form, I need to verify the validity of the repeat password field based on the password field. So I can't just add a validator the same way I did before, as this way I can get the value of the password field. What I'll do is, after I create the form, I will get on the form the repeat password field and I'll set its validators here. Now I have access to the form and I can create a simple custom validator that will check if the password and the repeat password fields are the same. So I'll just create a function called match password and repeat password, which receives a form of the type form group. Notice that the setValidators function expects to receive a validator fn as parameter, so my function has to return a validator fn. Alright, now let's implement this code. I'll create a constant called password that comes from the form's password field. I'll also create a constant called repeat password that comes from the form's repeat password field. The way this validator fn works is that it is a function that returns either null or an object containing the error. So I'll create another constant called validator, which is a function. The return of this function will verify if the password's value and the repeat password's value are equal. If they are, then there is no error and I'll return null. If they aren't, then I'll return an object containing the property isn't matching equal to true. And now I need to add this function to the validators of the repeat password field and pass to it the form. After I save this, our test will pass. Now let's test the validity of the whole form. I'll create a new test that it should form be valid. In this test, I'll expect that the form validity is true. After I save this, our test will fail. So let's just fill in all the fields correctly. I'll get on the form the field and put a valid value for all of them. After I save this, our test will pass. And that's all we need to validate in our form for now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the development of this real app using the Ionic Framework. Now let's add this form to our page, as for now our page doesn't even know this form exists. I'll go to the components file and I'll create a new property called register form of the type register page form. Let's now go to the components test and create a new test that it should create a register form on PageInit. First, I will start the page telling the fixture to detect the changes. Now I'll expect that on the component the register form is not undefined. After I save this, our test will fail. So let's tell our component to initialize the form. I'll create a private function called createForm. Inside of it, I will instantiate the register form with a new register page form. I need the form builder, so I'll inform that this component needs access to the form builder. Now I'll pass it to the constructor of the register page form. And finally, I'll call this function inside of the ngOnInit function. After I save this, my test will fail. It fails because I need to configure my test to import the reactive forms module. I'll also add the register page module here, so everything inside of the register module will be here automatically. After I save this, our test will pass. Alright, now let's finally put this form inside of the page. Inside of my page, I will wrap almost everything inside of an HTML form tag. For this form tag to be able to use the register form, we need to add a property called form group, which will receive the form by calling the registerForm.getForm. So now let's go to the app and let's do a before and after on each field. I'll go to the register page and we actually can see that there is an error on this. And this happens because I didn't add the reactive forms module to the imports of my register module. Let me save it and let's continue. I will pass through all the fields and you can see that no message showing that the field is required is showing up. So let's start by adding the validation to the name field. I'll go back to the page and add the property form control name to the name input, and I'll tell that it has to check the name property of our form. I'll save it and let me go back to the register page so we can see what's happening. If I enter the name field, we can see its line becomes red because the field is invalid. If I type anything, then the line becomes green as the field is now valid. Alright, I'll quickly do it for all the other contact fields as it's gonna be the same process, which is to add the form control name property and set to it the form field name. For the address information fields, we need another step as inside of the form I decided to separate the address fields inside of its own form group. What I need to do differently here is to wrap all the address fields inside of some component and tell that everything inside of this component belongs to a specific form group. To do this, I will add the form group name property, which will have the value of address. Now I can just continue the same process I was doing before, which is to add a form control name with the name of the field. Now let me save it, go back to the page and pass through all the fields, which should get all their lines red. And that's exactly what happened. Only the repeat password field is not red, but it isn't red because it is valid, as the password and repeat password fields are the same. If I enter anything on the field, then it becomes red. Cool, now let's show the error messages on each field. Let's start with the mandatory messages. To do this, I will use the error component we created on the video showing now on the top of your screen. Let me just copy the example of the login page as we use this component there and paste it here below the name field. Alright, so my component needs access to the form field, so I'll get the form using the registerForm.getForm function and I'll change the field from email to name. The error the component needs to check keeps being the required error. The error message should be name is mandatory. Also, I need to declare in my register module that now my register page is using the error message component. I'll save it and let's go back to the app to check how it looks now. If I enter the name field, its line becomes red. If I leave the name field without informing anything, then the error message shows up. Cool, now let me quickly do the same thing for all the other fields. The only different thing I had to do this time was on the address field to get first the address form group and then get the form field. Let's now go to the app, pass through all the fields and see their error message showing up. Cool. Now let's add the other validation messages, like the one validating that the email is valid, the one validating that the password has a minimum of 6 characters, and the one validating that the password and repeat password fields are the same. I'll copy and paste the email required error, change its error to email, and the message to email is invalid. I'll save it and let's check it on the app. If I don't put an email, the required email message shows up. If I put an invalid email, the invalid email message shows up, and if I put a valid email, the error disappears. For the password with a minimum of 6 characters, I'll do something very similar. I'll copy the required password error and paste it, change the error to min length, and the message to minimum of 6 characters. Let me save it and let's check it on the app. If I enter the password field and leave it, the required error shows up. If I come back to it and put 1 character, then the minimum error shows up. If I put 6 characters, then the error disappears. And now let's finally add the error message for password and repeat password. I'll copy and paste this password error, change its field to repeat password, and the message to password and repeat password are different. But what should I put in the error property? Remember we defined that when the fields have different values, we should return an object with the isn't matching property equal to true? Well, we just need to use here in the error the isn't matching value as the error. Let me save this and let's take a look at the app. I will input a password, and for the repeat password field, I will input a different password. The error message shows up. If I put the same password on both, then the message disappears. Cool, we are now showing all the error messages we need for the register form.